The Bible Treasury. A monthly magazine of papers on scriptural subjects. Volume 19, Article 1, Part 38 of 93, 1892 and 1893. The Early Chapters of Genesis. By William Kelly. Genesis 5 verse 3 to 5. That chapter 5 is in its only proper place, supposing one and the same hand wrote all the sections preceding it, is manifest from the exclusion of reference to Cain and Abel, and its notice of Seth as the true and appointed continuator of Adam's line to Noah. Previous and fragmentary documents, or not, is quite a subordinate question. But this is the more inviting for the speculative to discuss, as there is the slenderest basis whereon to display their skill in building their ingenious but shadowy schemes. The believer has before him the solid fact of a divinely carried out design, on a principle which discovers the enmity of a mind above man's, not here only but throughout the Old Testament, nor is there a single instance known to me of sure evidence against Moses as its writer. The ancient heathen themselves, in spite of their undying animosity against the Jews, were not in this as unbelieving as our modern critics who call themselves Christians. For where could the fruitful episode of chapter 4 stand suitably but where we find it? Yet this, to be exact, required the use of Jehovah alone for the first time in the narrative. Neither Elohim as in Genesis 1, Genesis 2 verse 3 would be in keeping, nor yet Jehovah Elohim as in Genesis 2 verse 4 and Genesis 3, each in its proper place, which is only proved the more by the exceptions in the language of the serpent and of Eve, Genesis 3 verse 1, 3, and 5. The conditions in Genesis 4 were no longer paradisaical but such as appealed to all the race now fallen, especially before men lapsed into idolatry, having still the traditional knowledge of God, not as creator only but in special relationship as moral governor of his offspring. Not for 2 millenniums and a half was that name with the law given to the chosen people as their distinctive possession and responsibility. But here they were shown, on the small primeval platform of Cain and Abel, the vanity for a sinner of natural religion, slighting, as it always does, the guilt and the judgment of sin, no less than sacrificial provision of grace bound up with faith in the coming and suffering Messiah who should destroy the enemy. It is remarkable that Eve, who had been misled by the serpent to forget the special relationship of Jehovah Elohim, said on the birth of Cain, "I have gotten a man from, or with the help of, Jehovah." It was like Sarah in Hagar's case looking for the seed of promise through nature. On the other hand, and in the same Genesis 4 verse 25, she said on the birth of Seth, "Elohim has appointed me another seed instead of Abel," the more to be observed, because in the next verse we are told that then it was man began to call upon the name of Jehovah. Now each of these designations is employed with exquisite propriety, and with an aim evident save to men walking in the darkness of Egypt. So mistaken are they who, ignorant of what is all important spiritually, fall into the delusion of striving to account for these differences and their accompaniments, by the fancy that the sections in which they occur are by different hands. It is the design, and this a divine one, which alone satisfactorily explains all the phenomena, and the more strikingly because they come from the same inspired writer. So in our Genesis 5, Elohim is the only proper term till we come to verse 29, where Jehovah is demanded by the aim of the inspiring Spirit. Difference of hand is the resource of incredulous ignorance. Cain and Abel had played their parts respectively, as all that hear the truth must, in the darkness of unbelief or the light of faith, and Eve, profiting by her early mistake, acknowledge her son Seth as substituted by Elohim for Abel whom Cain slew. Son of Adam, he the firstborn had gone out impenitent and in despair from Jehovah's presence, was building a city called after the name of his son, and began the world of arts and sciences, civilization, and pleasure, a wanderer far from the God who reveals his will and judges those that despise his Christ. With the appointed man people began calling upon his name, the foreshadow of the millennial day, compare Isaiah 11 verses 9 and 10, Jeremiah 3 verse 17, Zechariah 14 verse 9, Malachi 1 verse 11. Here till the close the sole correct designation is Elohim, and could not be Jehovah. It is the line of Seth from Adam to Noah. And Adam lived 130 years, and begot a son in his likeness, after his image, and called his name Sheth. And Adam's days after he begot Sheth were 800 years, and he begot sons and daughters. And all Adam's days which he lived were 930 years, and he died. Verses 3-5. When Elohim made man, Genesis 1 verse 26, he proposed it to be in his image, after his likeness. So he created him in his image, as it is said twice, Genesis 1 verse 27. And we have already seen, that, as likeness resembles, image represents a distinction which it is of moment to seize, as it holds everywhere in Scripture. The likeness consisted of qualities corresponding to God, as no other nature on earth had. The image was man's place in presenting him to others, as not even angels of heaven did or could. As man was made upright, so he was called to dominion over the lower creation. Angels fulfill his word and do his pleasure, yet they only minister, never rule. But now that the head of the race was fallen, he begot in his likeness, after his image. It was in his own likeness, not God's, and it was not Cain but Seth that is said to be after his image. Adam was represented by Seth, though he could not be said to be begotten after Elohim's likeness but Adam's. Yet it still remains true that man, even though fallen, is the image and glory of God, 1 Corinthians 11 verse 7. Hence the guilt of murder demanded death, for it was the extinction of what represented God on earth, even when man was no longer after his likeness, Genesis 9 verse 6. The comparison of our verse 1 makes it all the plainer, in the likeness of God made he him, Adam. The image of God was the emphatic point in Genesis 1 verse 27, and even in verse 26 takes precedence, however important the likeness which sin destroyed for Seth, whom Adam begot in his likeness, after his image. The race is fallen. What progeny Adam had during this early time we are not told, but simply that his days after he begot Seth were 800, and he begot sons and daughters. How little is said of the line of faith, especially if we compare the striking picture which the preceding chapter furnishes of the world's rapid progress in all that life which nature deems worth living. And all the days which Adam lived were 930 years, and he died. Verse 5. There is not the slightest sound reason to doubt the longevity here attributed to antediluvian man. Man was made to live, not to die. His death came in through sin. The truth of life will appear when the second man takes the world kingdom, Revelation 11. Those who live righteously when he reigns shall continue through the 1,000 years, none dying save under curse for rebellion, and the righteous, as scriptural principles imply, are at last changed, without passing through death, into everlasting incorruption, as Christians are entitled to expect who are alive and are left to the coming of the Lord, before his displayed kingdom begins, 1 Thessalonians 4, 1 Corinthians 15. Lengthened as the span of years may seem, compared with the measure which the prayer of Moses, Psalm 90, lays down as the ordinary rule of human life, they were but days of Adam or any other here recorded. After Adam, they were begotten, and they begot, they lived and they died. This sums up the history of most, but of this more when we review the account of others, as well as the exceptions.